Uh, Sada, can you check why
Yes.
Neha cannot unmute her mic?
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, please make Neha a co-host.
Yes. Give me.
Sada, can you check why Neha cannot unmute her mic?
Done. Done. Done.
Make Neha a co-host.
Hi.
Done.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
loud and clear.
Yes.
Okay,
perfect.
good. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
My gosh, it must be really early in the morning for you and Dilip.
Not too bad. It's 8 a.m., so it's
It's 8
okay.
a.m. Right.
Hi,
All right,
Shabri,
I'm
how
going
are
to.
you?
Hi, Dilip sir. Good to see you here. Yeah, good, good. Glad
You
that
have
you're
a
here.
beard.
I know, Dilip sir. This is my lockdown effect now. Actually, now it's been there for a year now.
Looks good.
Okay, I'm going to start in a little while. We've got something like 3 minutes. I
Okay, I'll,
see, I see Neha, I see Dilip,
yeah,
I see
Shahid sir
Rola,
is
I
here.
see
Hmm.
Shahidul Haq, and I do not see Sashi as
Yeah,
yet,
give me a second. I'll follow up with
but
it.
he will come back on this. But just to say, like I've sent in the mail, we'll start off with each one of you. I'll ask a question, and then anywhere between 6 to 7 minutes, and then we do a round again. Right? It would be good to see how you also build up on what previous speakers have said. So keep that in mind. For everybody else who is listening to this, we would request that you put your mics off so that I see Richard there now. So that's good.
Rishad's here. Yeah,
Uh,
We need to make him co-host now.
yeah.
so,
Rakesh, if you can make Rishad co-host.
and then if
Dilip
everybody
sir,
can,
namaskar. Namaskar, sir.
I
Namaskar.
see, I see, I see somebody here by the name Shashi. Shashi sir, is that you? And if it is, um, could we unmute the microphone for?
Yes.
There we are. Hello, how are you? How's
Hey,
everyone?
Shashi sir, good to see
Sir.
you.
hello, sir. How are you? Good to see you. Thank you for making it. So
Pleasure to be with
we will start in about a minute. So like I said, everybody else to mute their mics, and we can take it from there.
you. Excellent. Looking forward.
All right, so we can, I think, start now. And let me begin by starting by saying thank you to everybody uh, everybody who has joined this webinar. This is the third collaboration between GRFTD, MFA, and CCRM. Our previous two collaborations were on migration governance and on the role of missions. This is an issue that has picked up in the last 2 months, in a uh, particularly because of a campaign that was launched. But it was on the 1st of June. Some civil society organizations came together to launch this campaign calling for a transitional justice system, because in all the impact of the COVID, one of the biggest casualties was migrant workers. And a big proponent of those migrant workers were migrant workers who are being repatriated without their dues, without salaries, and with back wages pending. This issue has grown exponentially, and it was a result of this bringing attention to this issue that trade unions and civil society in the region got together to launch this campaign calling for a transitional justice mechanism. Since it was launched on the 1st of June, this campaign has got solidarity from people in the business sector, from some governments, from UN institutions, from trade unions, from national human rights institutions, from academia and civil society. It has resonated with many people in terms of the injustice that we are seeing. But in many ways, it has resonated also because this injustice has only exasperated what has been happening for years and years. And it is time in this process of building back together that we pay attention that if we are going to build back better, coming out of this COVID, we can't build it on flawed foundations of justice. Because in very many cases in the past, these issues were left unaddressed. And many migrant workers have returned to their homes empty handed and in debt. And it is to address this situation that an appeal has been put out to the international community and has resonated with an international community. It is urgent that we address this even as we start thinking of coming out of the COVID and start looking at migration flows and migration governance once again becoming the mainstream of development programs and development strategies among countries of origin and destination. Before I start, I would like to say that I would like to dedicate this session particularly to one of our colleagues who passed away last Narayan Swamy, a trade union leader who has spent many years bringing migrant worker cases to court in India. He has uh, been unrelentless in taking up this issue, and he has also helped in raising this issue through RTIs, in going to countries of destination, documenting cases, coming back home, processing it through the legal system. He has traveled miles and miles in India to reach migrant workers in their homes to document cases and take it up. And he has even spent a lot of his time and resources in taking up this cause. He passed away last week, and we will definitely miss him. He was a very brave soul, very courageous as he took up these cases despite the many oppositions that he had faced. I'd like to dedicate this to him. I'd like to also say that at the start of this call, I want to thank all of the speakers who are on this call, each of them, and I will not do introductions with regard to who they are. All of them are well known within the international community. For those who are encountering them for whatever reason for the first time, please do a Google and you'll find page after page about them. So thank you very much for joining this call. I'd like to thank again the three organizations that have come together and for the many other organizations that have endorsed this call. This is a collective effort coming to this point, and hopefully this is another launching moment for the call itself to take on this big challenge before us, which is not going to be easy. To reform a national justice system is not going to be easy, and to address a crime that has gone unnoticed for so many years is not going to be easy. But we are all in this period of COVID building our future on hope that there will be hope for a vaccine, that we will come out of these lockdowns, and that we will learn from this process and build back better. If we are going to do this, then we will have to galvanize our strengths, mobilize around this call for the sake of migrant workers. For so many of them, for whom this opportunity would be a lost opportunity because there's no way that they could process the cases. But for those who are now in the process and those who will be in this process, for them, we could make a magnificent difference. And this could be that moment of difference that we can harness. To start off with, then, I would ask everybody to keep their mics muted. We will use the chat box. We have a facility wherein any questions will be forwarded to me, and I will put those questions to the speakers as they come forward. So please use the chat box today as much as you can in terms of comments, insights, questions. So let us then begin. And I would like to begin, first of all, with Shashi Tharoor, who many of you know. He has written many books that we have read that has been part of our knowledge and understanding of how the world works. But he's also currently a member of parliament and a former undersecretary of the Secretary General of the United Nations. And let me begin then by asking you, Shashi, sir, that in what we see as extraordinary times, because these are extraordinary times, we see an exponential increase in the number of wage theft. And I know that this is something that you have seen just in the media coverage that you have in India and in your own state, kind of thing, of how this has been reported and carried, kind of thing. So from your experience and from what you have been engaged in, what are the avenues needed and avenues that could be explored at the international level to draw attention to this issue that takes place, and what existing systems are there basically where we can take this up as a collective, and because the current systems seem to be inefficient and ineffective and many times in addressing this issue of wage theft, and with millions at stake both in terms of workers and in terms of resources, what avenues in your experience is something that we can explore? To you, sir.
Right. Thank you very much. You can drop the sir, William. Good to see you all. And I'm glad you've gathered together on this very important topic. In my case, it's not just what I've read in the newspapers. I'm actually dealing with many of these cases as a member of parliament because, of course, a lot of people amongst the Indian migrant workers in foreign countries who are affected by problems of wage theft will often turn to their MPs for assistance. And so I've actually had to deal with multiple cases of this nature. And during my brief stint as a minister in the External Affairs Ministry, I also had an opportunity to speak to ministers of labor as well as of external affairs in many of the Gulf countries about some of these issues. This is one of the issues that I had to raise with them. Now, very simply, with the two kinds of problems involving wage theft, one is, of course, those affecting our Indian workers abroad, and the cases I'm most familiar with are indeed in the Gulf countries, because precisely the volume, the number of cases is so very large. But there's also a significant problem within the internal migration situation in India that's worth briefly acknowledging as well. In all these cases, there are three kinds of problems. One is that people write to me saying, we haven't been given our salary for 3 months. We haven't been given our salary for 6 months. We haven't been given our salary since we got here. We just basically given food to survive and nobody pays us anything, even though we were promised all sorts of things when we took up a job. That's the delayed payment situation. The second is the reduced payment situation, where you say you're promised 800 dirhams a month when you leave Kerala and you get 600 dirhams or 500 dirhams in your paycheck when you actually get to the country you're working in the UAE. And the final thing is, of course, is no payment. And those particularly happen, no payment at all, happens in situations of extremists. For example, war breaks out, civil war in Yemen, a civil war in Libya. A lot of our migrant workers suffered because, in fact, they didn't want to leave these war-torn places with bombs dropping all around them, because they said that everything we work for will be lost if we can't collect our wages before we leave. And many risked their lives. Some lost their lives, and we had to really work hard to get some of these people to evacuate because they literally had no payment. So we've got all of these injustices. And in all these situations, where the situation is not a war or a complete breakdown, then what I tend to do as an MP is to work through the embassies. Most of our embassies in these countries where we have substantial migrant workers have officers called a community welfare officer or an analogous title, whose sole job really is to look after complaints relating to Indian community members in those countries and their problems they're having. And wage theft is very often a significant problem. I must admit, they may be so burdened with the large volume of cases that they don't always give them the priority they deserve. And that's where an MP's intervention can often help. So when a complaint reaches me, I bring it to the attention of the ambassador, who pushes it down to the officer concerned, saying, pursue this, chase up the company, intimidate the company, and so on. and that often works. Of course, in many cases, workers are afraid to complain. Their passports have been impounded or confiscated by the employer, which is strictly speaking illegal, but it happens a lot. And very often the embassy has to step in and do something. But ultimately, the real problem we all have is that when people act in bad faith, when an employer really doesn't intend to pay and doesn't want to pay what he's contracted to pay or has promised to pay, there is very little by way of a mechanism of justice. The Indian embassy is not going to get involved in civil litigation in the courts of those countries. It is up to the worker. No worker can afford a court case. So unless a civil society organization like Migrant Forum in Asia is willing to step in and actually say, hey, we'll help, we'll file cases on your behalf or whatever, justice turns out to be very elusive. There is no overwhelming, overarching justice mechanism that anybody has established or been agreed to. And the problems, of course, are compounded by the whole lot of other problems. And if you look at the internal migrants in India, and we've all woken up to their situation when we faced the crisis at the beginning of the COVID lockdown, there may be 150 million internal migrants across our country. Many of them have minimal access to social security, negligible or no access to healthcare. There are no government schemes for them. There are no established grievance redressal mechanisms in the event of job disputes. And when they have non-payment of dues, where do they go? They can't again afford the court system. So it's a real problem that that migrant workers, whether internal or external, have no one to fight for them. I saw a 2018 study, which was reported on scroll.in, that said that wage theft in the construction industry alone is about 6,400 crore rupees per annum. And that's the kind of money we're talking about that is being denied to ordinary people for whom that money is what they're working for in order to survive. And I think it's absolutely criminal. It is unjust. And so the call for justice is indispensable. Now, with foreign workers, as I say, at least the embassy can make a preliminary intervention, and that sometimes works. But I think we need to go beyond that. We need mechanisms where, for example, governments in those countries should be pressed to engage provisions. One idea that I've had, for example, could be to actually ask the governments of the host countries, the receiving countries of Indian migrant workers, to require any employer seeking a visa for a migrant worker to place a certain deposit in escrow, which would cover, let's say, 6 months' wages of that employee, in order to ensure that if he defaults, instead of it being wage theft, the government would actually kick in and pay that deposit to the worker. Otherwise, the visa is not issued. I mean, this kind of policy might actually help if the governments of the host countries, who actually have more influence over their nationals and companies in their own countries, have more impact than, say, our embassy, which is, after all, a foreign embassy in another country. In terms of domestic labor, I think we need to strengthen both labor laws and migration laws. When I was in the External Affairs Committee as chairman, I fought very hard for 5 years, from the very first communication to the then foreign minister, the late foreign minister, Sushma Swaraj. I've been demanding a new immigration bill. And I was fobbed off with one excuse or the other. The immigration bill goes back to 1983. It's grossly inadequate in terms of recognizing the dimensions of immigration today and the problems we've actually experienced in the 40 years since that bill was drafted. And we really need an updated bill that will protect our workers, including from wage theft. But sadly, we don't have any progress on getting an immigration bill. And now that I have been moved off that committee by our wonderful government, and a BJP member now chairs that committee, it's going to be very, very difficult, I think, to insist that the government take the steps that they need to take. So these are some of the ideas: an immigration bill from India, action by the host governments for migrant workers, and then effective action by NGOs and civil society movements like yourself to give support, including, if necessary, legal assistance, in order to either prevent wage theft or remedy it when it happens.
Thank you for that, and I hear you on this, the role that the embassies and the missions could play, uh, and I'll just put a follow-up question with regard to that, because one of the things that we ourselves have noticed is that there is a power dynamic that does come into play between country of origin and country of destination. There is also a question of resources, there is a question of capacity, there is a question of limitations with regard to the embassies. And like you said, then sometimes we civil society organizations have to resort to MPs or other kind of leverage to get the embassy to move, kind of thing. So, but the question, and you rightly also pointed out that at the end of the day, it's a countries of destinations national justice system that needs to be improved. It's not that the embassies of foreign nations are going to improve that. So this kind of deficit of national justice systems in countries of destination to look into these issues of migrant workers, and the which are not being addressed. How do we raise that issue? And you have of course talked about from the Indian perspective, but if we also know that governments are involved in bilateral agreements, in regional processes, is in international discourses like the Global Forum on Migration and Development, in the Global Compact on Migration. Shouldn't these spaces be used to be able to bring together some collective understanding and a collective kind of a rationale for moving forward the issues of migrant workers, particularly these kind of vulnerabilities? Can't these spaces be spaces for that, rather than put so much of a burden on the country of origin to fight for its people?
No, I agree with you, William. I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, these are amongst the issues I raised in the External Affairs Committee in my last year when the Global Compact on Migration was being negotiated. And I asked our negotiators to come and testify before the committee as to what they were doing to protect our workers. Not enough is my short answer, but that's another matter. Um, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which in many ways is the institution that we should all look to for maintaining standards of labor around the world, they have predicted that about 195 million jobs are going to be wiped out during the pandemic. So this is a huge immediate crisis. What you and I have been talking about is a chronic problem that predates COVID and will probably last beyond COVID and which needs to be addressed. But it's getting desperately intense during the COVID pandemic. And we are finding case after case, I'm hearing about anecdotes in which employers and countries are offering migrant workers a straight choice between losing their jobs and working on slash salaries, signing reduced contracts, or actually just accepting verbal contracts, unwritten, unsigned, in which they settle for half the salary they're supposed to be paid. And you've gone to a foreign country, you've often incurred a huge amount of expense, inconvenience, and difficulty to go. You're from a poor family, you have no job or other security waiting for you back in your home country. What do? You go along with whatever is imposed upon you. And what's happened is that COVID has become an excuse for all these people to do the worst things that we have seen before COVID, and they're doing it this way. There is simply no transnational mechanism to address these concerns. The Global Compact is a non-binding declaration of pious intent. It leaves workers susceptible to exploitation and salary theft. And don't forget that external migrants across borders, have all sorts of other added pressures. There's visa expiration issues. You have to get an entry visa when you go in with certain conditions. You need an exit visa before you can leave. Your passports are often impounded by your employers. If you stay late, there's overstay fines. If you give trouble, the employer may not give you back your passport or may not give you any wages. It's an incredibly difficult situation, and wage theft becomes widespread unless you're lucky enough to have a good faith employer, which obviously many do, but I'm just saying that many don't, and that's precisely the problem. So civil society organizations such as yours, such as the Migrant Forum on Asia, are crucial. I mean, obviously you guys have to operate along with unions, workers, collectives, and so on, to ensure that workers are able to access the benefits they're entitled to. I agree with you, we can't leave it all to our own government, and frankly, our own governments have not always been, as I've pointed out with the example of the immigration bill, our governments have not always been on the ball in standing up for immigrant workers' rights. They've got enough on their plates from their point of view. And I think that if we look at our domestic laws, they're very, very often inadequate. The labor code on wages that came out last year actually dilutes the responsibility of the principal employer for wage payment and has replaced labor inspectors with facilitators. And we've got a situation where, I mean, if you take one example, the construction workers in our country need a welfare card to obtain income support. But when you had a survey being conducted among construction workers, who are all migrant workers, internal migrants in India, it turned out that only 1 in 5 workers had a card. Now, obviously, with external migrants, documentation is not a problem, but lack of communication is. Lack of language skills definitely becomes a problem. How many of our workers can even understand what their rights are and execute them or pursue them in a country where everything is done in the language they don't know? So these are all genuine problems. I'm sorry, I know you're looking for solutions in this conversation, but all I can say is we need to fight on.
So I will propose at least a partial solution of how we could, and as a member of parliament, and I see a former member of parliament also here, Mr. Kuntia, also, and I was wondering, and you have pointed out the role of missions. Part of the call is because there are a lot of these kind of restricted flights, these repatriation flights, which are being organized by countries of origin. Part of the call is requiring that when workers register for this repatriation flight, that they should be given a chance to lodge any labor grievance that they have before taking on that flight unconditionally. And the embassy should then secure the power of attorney so that even if the worker has left the country, the possibility of pursuing that case is still exist. And it would be great to see if this could be taken up in the Indian Parliament, and missions would start documenting this. We have already lost a lot of data in the sense of more than 500,000 to 600,000 workers have already come back in repatriation flights, but we know that this is going to go into the millions by December. So it would be really great to get some movement in Parliament on this.
That's a very, very good idea, William. I don't know if Parliament alone is a mechanism, but certainly as an individual MP from a constituency with a significant number of migrant workers, I can certainly write to the Foreign Minister as well, requesting this. And waiting for Parliament may not be a good idea because these Vande Bharat flights are continuing right now, even as we speak. So I'll certainly take up the idea very much, very, very quickly. It's an excellent idea, and I don't think it should be that difficult to implement. I will suggest it. I will certainly suggest it. Thanks for that. That's a good one.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for your time as well on this call. I know you.
Just one last thing, and I do have to leave because I have another function at 6. I just wanted to say that you had asked about whether any international mechanisms or transnational mechanisms are possible. I know very often people talk about the Iraq Compensation Commission at the UN, which paid compensation for people whose lives, wages, companies, etc., have been disrupted by the Iraq war. That is not a good model. That won't work. And the reason is very simply this. Number one, Iraq had sanctions upon it, and Iraq had to put all its oil money into an escrow account managed by the UN. So inevitably, the UN actually had money from which they could pay out this compensation. Whereas today, there is no, neither the United Nations nor the International Labour Organization nor the International Organization for Migration has any sequestered money from any government, let alone from any private employer, to compensate lost wages. So I do want to stress, for wage theft, when you look for international solutions, they have to be more in the terms of laws, policies, regulations, and something that I suggested for foreign countries would be, as I said, fixed deposits to be paid by people seeking visas for immigrant workers, rather than some sort of overarching international or transnational compensation commission. That's not on offer. But I would call for greater support for the ILO's work. I think there should be more labor resolution mechanisms, including labor tribunals, for migrant workers under the ILO's umbrella. They're an organization that brings together employers as well as unions, as well as governments, and that's the only UN body that really does that. So we need to maximize what we can get out of that. I like very much your idea on registering labor grievances. Collection of evidence is also very important to ensure that labor laws are followed. And in the meantime, emergency relief programs. I mentioned legal aid so that our migrant workers are able to pursue justice. But also perhaps we all need to look for donors so that we can actually stand between an unpaid migrant worker who's suffered wage theft and absolute starvation. Very often there's no one there to turn to unless some mechanism is created that will address that. So those are some final ideas. Thank you so much for having me with you. And my apologies, I have to abandon the discussion at this point, but your questions have really got me off thinking in a constructive light, and you've given me an idea I will follow up immediately.
And thank you for your idea as well. So on this escrow fund, this has been a thought that has been circulating for some time now. And I think in the building back better, as countries do bilaterals and things like that with countries of destination, this might be an important issue to put both within global discussion, but also within bilateral discussions. So thank
Great.
you for that. Thank you so
Thank you
much,
very
sir,
much
for your
Thank
time.
you.
Thank you. And now we move on. And I come to Rola Hamati from the Center for Cross-Regional Network for Migrants and Refugees, and who has also co-launched this together with the other three organizations, Solidarity Center, Lawyers Beyond Borders, MFA, CCRM. Rola, just to situate the context of what we are talking about, what is this transitional justice system? And we've just heard Dr. Shashi talk about it and say possibly at the international level, it might be a real challenge. But from your perspective, why now? And what is it? And what potential does it have in the light of the fact that this is an issue that has been, and you just heard Shashi Tharoor say as well, it's been happening way before COVID, and it will even happen after COVID, according to him. So why this campaign? Why now? And what sustainable potential it has?
Thank you. Thanks, William, for the question. Maybe I can first part of your question, the question of the why. And in doing so, maybe I can try to kind of discuss some of the things that we all know, some of the things I guess that everybody on this webinar would agree with. Number one, I think, is that at any point in time and any moment, we know that wage theft is kind of the chief complaint by migrant workers. Anybody that knows migration knows that this is kind of the biggest issues that migrant workers complain about. And this is something that cuts across different sectors. It's not a sector-specific issue. It's something that goes from big construction companies where you hear about numbers in the hundreds to smaller kind of enterprises, to even individual employers. The constant complaint is that there was always issues with payment of wages, always issues with wage theft and all of that. I guess the second thing, and I think this is very, very sad, is that at some level, this has become normalized. This has become normal and internalized, not just by migrants, but also by people who work with migrants. And we know that, for instance, a lot of workers, they put up with wage theft for a lot of reasons, including, for instance, not knowing how to file complaints, being afraid of filing complaints, or even simply just giving up on the system because the system is not working for them. So this becomes kind of the new normal. We end up saying that it's okay, it's not something bigger, but in reality, it's really not okay. My third point, I guess, is that also at any given time, we also know that very few of the cases of wage theft are cases that make their way to courts. And this is something that we've known, for instance, in the Middle East region has existed for a very long time. Very few of the cases are actually cases that go to court. And very few of these cases that go to court are justly resolved, because we know even those cases that make their way to court have a lot of difficulty in terms of accessing justice. And this is a result of so many things, and I'm not going to discuss at length why do these cases not go to court, but simply to say we've known for a very long time now that the justice system really does not work for migrant workers. My fourth point as to answering your question, William, and really as to the why this campaign. All these 3 points that I've previously mentioned are things that have happened long before COVID, and probably will still happen after COVID. But I think if you want to look at the COVID situation and what it has brought, we know that it has had a big and profound impact on jobs and employment. And we know that in a context, for instance, where migrant workers are kind of the last to be hired and the first to be, fired, the situation of wage theft has been really exacerbated. So what we are seeing is really something of a non-precedented scale of people being let go of their jobs, not paid their wages, not paid their benefits. And really, when you are in a foreign land, when you don't have a lot of options, when the justice system doesn't really work for you, you don't really have a lot of options as to what you do. What we are seeing is really a situation of people being let go and having to return back home without their wages and even without the possibility and without a tangible way for them to claim what was lost. So I think this has been kind of the boiling parts that have brought together this campaign. And the whole idea is really that we cannot continue under what was normalized. We cannot continue to turn a blind eye to these violations that are happening. And it's not just a question, it's not just an argument of scale, it's not just because we are seeing large numbers, because at the end of the day, it's not a question of numbers, it's a question of each and every individual migrant being able to make the most of their migration journey. We know that people, when they leave, they don't leave for the work experience, especially in these kinds of, in these kinds of jobs that people do. They're not leaving for the work, they're not leaving for the fun of it, but they're leaving for the potential of a better life. And yet they are coming back with nothing. And I think this is very significant. And this is something that, makes us want to act now, makes us want to do something now. So that was kind of, the initial inspiration or the idea behind the campaign. And the campaign is really just a simple coming together of civil society and trade unions. And this coming together is of us thinking that there could be a better way, there could be an alternative. This does not have to be the normal, and this cannot be the new normal on which we will build back better. So the campaign is really very simple, and I think if we sum it up, and I know you've kind of, in your question, you've touched on the whole issue of the international system, but the campaign asks are really very basic and very simple. And I think number one is that we are saying at the international level, there has to be a system that responds and resolves the issues of wage theft. And I know Dr. Shashi Tharoor spoke about, the UN Compensation Commission, and maybe the particular kind of historical and financial, singularities that made that possible. And while this is true, at least at the international level, we must find a way for us to come together to ensure that there is justice for wage theft. And the idea we are proposing here is basically a very simple idea of having a claims commission. And I know Dr. Tharoor touched on the idea of work tribunals or labor tribunals, as he called them. And I think our idea is very, very similar in that context. It's similar in the sense of we need an international system that facilitates expedited access to justice, expedited trials. And this is why we have called for an international claims commission, but also to be accompanied by the fund, because obviously we know that the resources is a big question. And in thinking about the fund, we really thought about having this fund happen at the national level, precisely because of the difficulties in resourcing and all of that. And the second part, and I think this has already come up in the webinar, is the whole idea of, and the whole urgency actually, the whole idea of needing to reform the national justice systems, precisely because, as everybody said so far, and I'm sure everybody else will continue to say, national justice systems have so far failed migrant workers. So what kind of measures can we put in place to ensure that, at the national level, there are measures taken to reform national justice systems? And these are simple, and we've discussed a lot of these solutions already. And there are more, I am sure. And these are very simple, from ensuring documentation to ensuring migrant workers can have, can have power of attorney, that they can file claims before that they leave, that they can pursue claims after they leave, that there are expedited, labor courts at the national level, that there are translation services. So, I mean, it's a whole range of measures that we know and that we are actually, as a group of civil society and trade unions, putting together to work also with governments in order to express a political will as well to address this issue. And I think your last kind of follow-up, William, was really about the vision And I think the vision here is very important, because our vision, post-COVID and during COVID as well, is a world where these things do not have to happen, is a world where migrant workers can actually access justice for violations. And is a world where, the lack of justice is no longer kind of causing impunity for employers, because we also see this a lot. Knowing that they can get away with it, employers continue to do it. And I think it's time now, with the COVID situation, for all of us to come together to try to end the situation, and really the possibilities are within our reach.
Thank you, Rola, and thank you for explaining the campaign. And you came to this point towards the end. Of course, while we call on governments to look at the justice system of how it's failing migrant workers and things like that, uh, what about employers and businesses, the corporate accountability that needs to happen? We've got, of course, the global compact, which is, and from which came the Ruggie principles at the UN level. We've got this working group on business and human rights. Now the mantra is ethical recruitment and things like that. There is a whole move to get, and within the GFMD, there is what is called a business mechanism and things like that. So there is a whole constituency, which is actually the immediate constituency that deprives migrants of their wages in a sense. So how does this call plan to bring that accountability into focus?
Yes, no, thanks, William. And this is really a kind of a very good question. I think we have been thinking about this issue in particular, in trying to say, well, obviously, wage theft does not happen on its own. In a lot of cases, it's, individual employers, but in other cases as well, in a lot of cases as well, it's a question of big businesses. It's a question of, big corporations and all of that. And we are actually trying to get together as a continuation of this call, because the first call was actually on June 1st. The second call was in mid-July. And as a continuation of this effort, we are working on specific asks for business, specific ways in which businesses can come together and say, we are also addressing the issue of wage theft, because part of working on wage theft is not just related to being able to access justice after the fact happens, but also what can we do to kind of prevent wage theft altogether. And part of it is obviously regulatory, because a lot of it can be done through policies, through introducing laws, measures, and all of that. For instance, wage protection systems and all of that. But also another part of it is by businesses coming together and also putting kind of standards, putting procedures that ensures that wage theft does not occur. I mean, one example I can think of is like opening, ensuring access to information and transparency to information, and opening kind of books for people to be able to look at it and to audit and to ensure it complies. So this could be one measure, for instance, that the business can take on. But this is definitely something that the campaign is also kind of addressing as well.
Thank you for that, Rola. And I would like the panelist to also pay attention to the chat box. There are some very interesting questions being put there. If you want to take up some of those questions, I'll just point out one question that was put up to the panelist. Can we not think of creating a regional tribunal to look into migrant rights related to transnational justice affairs? How viable is this proposition in terms of consensus building among the governments supported by IOM, ILO, and OHCHR? But obviously, these questions are focused on the justice dimension and bringing that justice. So please look at the chat box as well for questions like that, and see if you want to take them up. Let's move to now to Sir Shahidul Haq, who is a senior fellow of the North-South University of Bangladesh, and also a former foreign secretary of Bangladesh. And I have walked, and some of us in this call have walked many steps with him in global, national, regional corridors, working on international frameworks, working on bilateral agreements, discussing on regional processes and things like that. And very often he has been a very strong ally of civil society in the advocacies that we have raised, even in his time as Foreign Secretary. And we're very grateful for that support that we have received from him. But let me put this question to you now, sir. how can countries of origin, and we heard a little while Shashi Tharoor talk about India and the, in a certain sense, the helplessness also of countries of origin having to work through their missions and finding ways to leverage and things like that, because missions can't, and then members of parliament have to weigh in and things like that. So there is definitely a kind of weakness in this migration governance program, where countries of origin don't seem to have that oomph or that power or that little bit extra that is needed to ensure the protection of the rights of their citizens, the labor rights of their citizens in countries of destination. So the question then to you is, how can countries of origin therefore address this issue? And we've heard that it's pre-existing and will continue to exist. How can they continue to address this issue in migration corridors? And what real hope is there? Have there been any successes that you have been able to negotiate, or Bangladesh, or you know of successes? And what are some of the big challenges if we are going to get this kind of accountability and justice? Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much, William, and good to see so many familiar faces after rather a long break. Thank you, William, and the organizers for bringing the whole issue of transitional justice to the world of migration. I think we had focused more on the governance issue rather than on a transitional justice issue within the migration realm. So it's certainly something that that we need to reflect and look at. And we have heard also from Dr. Shashi Tharoor in terms of origin country perspective. Now, while I agree that some of the inequalities, some of the injustice, some of the rights violation or wage theft have been taking place before pandemic, and hopefully it will stop if we are able to put forth a strong mechanism. Now, although it has been happening, but we know that how difficult it has been to bring in the whole issue of rights into the onto the floor. Rishad, I'm sure, will focus on how ILO has been struggling with it. We have done and made some progress, but there's a lot to be made. I think I think today we are looking at the wage discrimination. I think that's indeed a very critical issue, and I think because of the pandemic, it got exposed and to a great extent accelerated. All of a sudden, we found that this is something unacceptable, although it has been happening, possibly affecting quite significantly the individual level. Now, why all of a sudden this has been an issue? I'll bring in the issue of Bangladesh. Currently, there are about, we hear various figures, but 500,000 migrant workers have come back, mostly from the Middle Eastern country, without a almost penniless. So, you know, what has happened? Some of them have been working for 15, 16, 20 years. What has happened to their resources that they accumulated over the years? I know Dilip is here. He will bring these issues of asset and the remittances. One issue is that, you know, they could not bring back with portability of their benefits and their assets, which was created over the years. One. The second is that all of a sudden their contracts were terminated without any compensation, and that's why our Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has been raising this issue recently in the ILO forum, that, you know, it just cannot be allowed to go on. So the discussion is very timely. There's another side of the story. You know, there are about, in every country there are migrants who are about to fly out. You know, migrants in waiting to go and get a job. They have done all the formalities. They have paid all possible sources, and now they can't move. So that's the other part of the injustice that's happening, where recruiters, sometimes smugglers or migrants are very very active. Now, having this explained it, what that we could or we should do in terms of bringing the justice back. This is an opportunity. You know, when the pandemic hits and any crisis hits, it creates huge challenge, but it also you know, makes everybody stop and rethink that way we have been living and working. So Secretary General in his speech at the Mandela Foundation, talked about it's a generational opportunity, and those who have followed him, he did actually bring out very strongly the whole issue of migrants, refugees, and other minorities within the context of discrimination. He said, if you want to build back better, justice has to be ensured. And he's talking about new global deals. So that's one space where I think these kinds of a debate should fit in, and our colleagues in ILO and World Bank and other places could create space. So it's very right timing in terms of discussion. So that's one in the UN. Also, I know that Sabri and others know that in the World Economic Forum, you have been, William, you have been talking about how do you bring in corporate world. The World Economic Forum, which is rich man's club, quote unquote, I haven't said it, where there's a talk of a great reset, which would be the focus of the next year's Davos, which is likely to be more virtual than physical, where also there's a discussion as to how migration or migrants are likely to create difficulties or facilitate the way business. And recently they have done a global survey identifying what are the risks of business. There are 31 different kinds of risk. And the fifth largest risk is actually emanating from the migration and migratory process by restricting the mobility. So they are also looking at, in a big way, the whole issue of migration and the migrants' right. So that is the other space where we jointly could intervene and create a space within the corporate world. It's not easy. This is not something they like, but they are open to all kinds of ideas, especially those who are in Geneva and in Washington. They can really make a major breakthrough. The third area that I think, in terms of creating space to push forward this agenda, is the whole compact and the SDG 10. As you know, the Secretary General and the report, SDG report, which came out of the Cambridge University, focuses on inequality. And brilliantly, actually, the migration and the inequality, the wage are placed within global on the G10, on the MDG, SDG 10. So that's the other space where we need to create and bring in the concept of justice. I've been trying to sort of find out about the transitional justice. I know, but I think how that will be seen by the others need to be thought out before we start using the word transitional justice, or shall we say justice for migrants. That becomes less kind of a baggage, because with the transition then comes in the government and the conflict. So these are some of the areas that we can try and build a voice. And I actually like the whole idea of establishing an international claim commission. Currently, we are fighting for the Rohingyas in another commission, which is an uphill task. This will be much bigger difficulties in terms of compensation. That's a nightmare. I have, as a director, rather in a young life in the Foreign Office, have dealt with the Kuwaiti compensation fund, which has been a big exercise in terms of making sure that people can submit a claim rightfully. And that was much more structured because we had kept the evidences of their forced return back home. So in this case, it will be much more difficult, but certainly it could be a good beginning. I think we should bring back the whole issue of entitlement and justice in the world of governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you for that, for raising the point that we have concentrated on governance and less on rights and justice, and the need to now we talk about building back better, to base it on justice, at least to give the foundation of justice to any new programs on migration and governance. And thank you very much for that. I agree with you when it comes to funds and things like that. This will always be a challenge, but it is a challenge that we have to rise up to. Too many have suffered before this. Too many are suffering now. And I must say, we are, as MFA, we are already documenting cases of workers who have come back, and the suicide situation growing among workers, largely because they are coming back to little or no hope. So it's so important that we take this up. And you have also talked from how you have said that this is a generational challenge, quoting the Secretary General. And I know that you yourself have been calling for the need for us to come back together. And I've heard you in a previous conversation talk about a platform. You yourself had times recognized lack of leadership. And if you'll allow me to say this, at least the way I interpreted it many times was lack of leadership, even within the UN systems kind of thing when it comes to issues of this. And so as we come back together, somebody who's involved, who has been involved in a lot of these negotiations, knows how political they can get and things like that. What is your thinking in terms of countries of origin who will on this issue face the biggest challenge? How do we as countries of origin, is there any hope in processes like GFMD, Colombo process, Abu Dhabi dialogue, ASEAN Forum on Labor and Migration, even the Global Compact? We heard Shashi Tharoor say a little while ago that that's elusive kind of thing, so non-binding. So where can we, what in all these frameworks is there something for us to link on to and take that and realize that, operationalize that?
Thank you very much, William, for raising it. I have been saying that the migration is an issue of geopolitics, and you have rightly pointed out it's a power game between origin countries and destination countries, between market and migrant workers. And in both the context, the origin countries and the migrant workers are relatively weaker parties. So because of that, and because essentially it is a political process, at the end, the migrants lose out, number one. Number two is, the origin countries often struggle with a gain that or rights that need to be ensured of their migrants versus their bigger global agenda, which are often known as national interest. So when when Bangladesh is negotiating on this rights issues or wage issues, or even forced return issues, right now I know with I'll not name, with most of the Middle Eastern countries, they often remain very conservative, that because of a stronger role, either bilaterally or regionally or globally, we might at the end suffer. So that's a manifestation of a power game, which is unlikely to go away. And if it goes away, it is the multilateral forum, which has been weakened. Somebody the other day say it has become dysfunctional. So that we have to keep that in the context. But having said this, also both the SDG and the compact, which has been signed by 152 countries, and out of these 152 countries, all the GCC countries are included. So whether it is binding legally or morally, or that I think we can the rest of our life go ahead and debate, but it has certain value. Now the question is whether these instruments which are available being used by the member states, by the origin countries. Certainly the civil society is very active. I often hear about it, but at the country level, I see, this is like any other UN document, just, you adopt it and put it on the shelf. unless your life is under threat, you don't bring it out. So if that what is our mindset, then it's very difficult to bring a real significant change the way William, we all are thinking. Now, having said this, sounding little pessimist, let me be optimist, because I'm a born optimist. I think the way the civil society has pushed the whole human rights issues in the UN forum, human rights of migrant, as you know that there were time when UN colleagues even didn't use the word human rights of migrants together, as if this doesn't go. From there, we have moved. So if we start talking about justice, talking about entitlement under a changed circumstances, when we are thinking of that, whatever the way we have been dealing our life is absolutely shattered. There's a fractures all over the place, in the economy, in the society, and in politics. So let's bring them back. If that, with that spirit, you bring the debate back, and there are some pioneers, we may be able to make breakthrough. That's why I was saying that, take on World Economic Forum, where the companies comes and they hear. They may not get convinced, but they hear, and there's a long-term impact the moment they see that this is a risk factor for making benefit or profit. They will change also themselves. That's how the change in the industry has come around. 14th, 16th century industries were worse than slum conditions, and see some of the things have come in. I'm sure that Rishad will bring some of the things. It is not easy. It's a long process, but we have to take on. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, again for that. I like this concept of coming back, building that better with justice as an entitlement. I think that's fantastic for if we take this notion forward as we come out of COVID in relation to migration governance. That would be fantastic. I also am with you, an optimist, in particularly in using these kind of frameworks. I fully agree with you. Right now, at least the compact seems to be more a civil society thing as a stakeholder pushing it. There's been less traction on governments, at least we have seen in two of the regions that we are involved in. But and we see that the UN is relying largely on civil society to take it forward, and how much work, really much more work needs to be done with governments. There's still a big deficit there. But let me move on to the next speaker now. But before I do that, I want to raise a comment to the panel, a comment that has been put in the chat box, and I'm coming to the speakers who will have to talk about it, is that why don't you ask the ILO and World Bank to put together the Wage Justice Fund with contributions from those that benefited from labor migration. Banks and remittances transfer companies should be made to contribute to this fund. World Bank DILIP has data that could help identify the just and fair contribution from the earnings, profits, and remittances charges. When DILIP, something for you to think about before your turn comes. But let me go to Rishad. You've heard a lot about the ILO in this last hour, about the ILO taking up responsibility. I'm, if had it not been for COVID, I would be in another celebration of 100 years of ILO. But COVID has put a damper to some of those celebrations. Uh, there's an echo, I think. Uh, but Richard, all that is said with regard to ILO as the institution that is responsible for standards, that is the safeguard for against wage theft. What is the ILO, or what can the ILO do in this regard? And my specific question to you is, because it's a recurring issue, I'm sure in the standards committee it has come up over and over again. How, and in the end, it's your constituency, it's governments, it's business, it's your constituency as the ILO. What can the ILO do in this regard? How can the ILO take this forward? What needs to change? We've heard about justice systems from Rola and Shashi and Shahidul Haq talk about change, a reform that needs to be done. So how does ILO, with its constituency, institute this change or bring about this change? Rishad, over to you.
Okay, thank you, William. And these are searching questions, and I'm not sure I have sort of ready-made answers for them. But I'm really enjoying this discussion. I think it's really important. And first of all, I want to thank you and CCRM and GRFDT for organizing this and raising this issue of transitional justice in relation to wage theft for repatriated migrant workers. And of course, when we talk about wage theft, we're not just talking about non-payment or of wages, or increasingly, I think, as Dr. Tharoor pointed out in his remarks, migrant workers effectively being perhaps asked, but that would be a very soft term, required to accept reduced wages without really much opportunity to, to bargain this collectively with employers, which we know is a real challenge when it comes to the Middle East. And there are increasing evidence of non-payment of end-of-service benefits, which of course are significant when we talk about migrant workers who have been in the country for a long period of time. And this really is their social security, for lack of a better word, because there's very little social security in the Asia Middle East corridor. And if they lose this amount, this is of course very, very significant. So thank you for bringing this issue up. And it is important, as ILO, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have tried to bring as much attention to the need for workers not to leave or be repatriated without getting, as you say, their dues. And it's actually been harder to advocate for this than may appear to be the case, because often the humanitarian situation of many of these migrant workers, particularly those in irregular status, is very much at the forefront. And, in listening to Dr. Tharoor, particularly when he was talking about the role of embassies, we see a very fragmented picture in this regard. So, for example, in Lebanon, when the issue of repatriated migrant workers came up, the Philippines told us very clearly that they work or try to work as much as possible with the Ministry of Labor, as well as with employers, to ensure that migrant workers are paid their wages before they return. So that's obviously a very commendable approach. However, we don't necessarily see this with all the embassies. And this also plays out in the power relations between destination and origin countries that we heard of earlier. So whereas embassies can do a lot, they can't replace the operation of the rule of law, or taking an impartial approach to the settlement of disputes between workers and employers. And as you rightly said, William, in your question, and this has already been raised by the other speakers, and particularly when we look at the Asia Arab states labor migration corridor, indeed the pandemic has magnified many of the recurring structural flaws, and as we often refer to as ILO, decent work deficits. And non-payment of wages was one of these structural flaws among many others, including the operation of the very restrictive kafala sponsorship system. So just to say that, and this system is also contributes, I think, to the issue of wage theft, because of course employers are afforded significant power over their workers, and to some extent, this is delegated from the authorities, from the government, and this goes directly also to the issue of non-payment of wages when the going gets tough, so to speak, as has been the case in the context of the pandemic. I mean, in relation to the role of the ILO, and you mentioned standards, but of course ILO has this constitutional mandate to promote social justice. So justice is very much at the heart of the ILO's mission. And this is reflected, of course, also in the setting of minimum labor standards at the international level. And a significant standard in this regard is a convention called the Protection of Wages Convention, which has actually been accepted by quite a lot of countries, 98 countries. And it says quite clearly that if a contract is terminated, then wages have to be settled. And, you know, according to the laws, collective agreements, etc., that exist, but in the absence of those, within a reasonable period. And clearly, this is something which is not happening, particularly in the Middle East. I should also add, and of course, labor standards need to be accepted by by governments. That this convention, when it comes to the Middle East, has only been accepted by one country in the region, and that country is Lebanon. So none of the GCC countries have signed up to it. As Rula already mentioned in her remarks, yes, the majority of labor complaints we know concern non or late payment of wages. And one of the things that the ILO has been doing in the region is to strengthen the mechanisms that already exist. And the problems with these mechanisms are very well known. And Rula identified a number of these, so I won't go through them again. And there has been some progress in the region with regard to the improvement of these mechanisms. So it's not just about the courts, it's about being able to, for example, resolve your complaints in a less formal manner within the Ministry of Labour through dispute resolution. Courts have also been made accessible. Some of you may be aware of the system in Abu Dhabi where complaints can be filed in a number of different languages, where there's accelerated justice, mobile courts have been set up, etc. We have a program in Qatar, as many of you are aware, and we're working there with the Ministry of Labour to improve the dispute resolution mechanism, facilitate complaints made by migrant workers. In Qatar, there's also a very interesting mechanism that was recently established, the Workers' Support and Insurance Fund, which is supposed to facilitate the payment of, what is due to workers before, so they can leave the country, and then the issues, the payments are recovered from employers. So there are, and we're also working in Kuwait to improve the access to justice mechanisms there. But certainly when it comes to, these mechanisms were already deficits, they were wanting, and they've been very much found wanting as a result of the pandemic. But clearly, in the first instance, the way forward is to indeed work on these mechanisms to include what's taken place, to improve what the mechanisms at the national level. And there is work ongoing, but it's slow. And in an extreme situation like this, as I've said, these mechanisms have certainly been found wanting. In terms of reforms that can be initiated, and I guess you also want to hear about what the role of the ILO can be. Well, as I've said before, the ILO is no stranger to this issue, and you already alluded to this, William, in your question. And we do have a supervisory system. And in the past, when workers have been expelled in large numbers, and here I'm referring specifically to expulsions of workers that occurred in Africa during the 1980s from countries like Libya and Mauritania, complaints were brought against these governments to ensure that workers would be paid unpaid wages. the advantage, of course, in these processes were some of the countries at issue had actually accepted the Wage Protection Convention, which is not the case, as I've already said, with regard to some of the countries in the Middle East. But obviously there are other standards that may be relevant as well in this context, like the Forced Labor Convention, if workers are, required to continue working while not being paid. And that's a convention that has been more widely ratified by countries in the ILO system. Now, as far as ILO's possible engagement in a transitional, transnational justice mechanism, and there have been references in the chat box to, possible regional mechanisms that could be set up. Well, this will obviously require an international mandate and all the countries concerned to be on board. It's difficult to see this existing in a vacuum or something that is run just by civil society or by private actors, right? So a lot of advocacy would need to take place. Including in listening to Shahid's remarks, he already references some governments raising this issue before the ILO. And of course, ILO constituents and particularly governments and workers' organizations have an important role to play to raise these issues within ILO governance structures. Dr. Tharoor referred and this will be one of my last points, to the UN compensation mechanism that was set up after the end of the first Gulf War, which really dealt with war reparations in both Iraq and Kuwait. And he said that this was not necessarily a good model. And I can see where he's coming from. Of course, there was more political will then. This commission had a clear international UN mandate, which flowed from the UN Security Council itself. There was already money in the bank, so to speak, because the fund was supported by Iraqi oil. But I think what the ILO did manage to do with regard to this compensation commission was to draw its attention to the need to settle the so-called small claims before the larger corporate claims were addressed. And these claims concerned migrant workers that were, required to depart in the emergency situation without having their wages settled. So the fact that attention was brought to the need to deal with the small claims, that even though they were small in sort of more global terms, they were nonetheless very important to the individuals, to the families and the communities affected by non-payment of wages. And I think that's a very important lesson going forward. There are a lot of people, of course, corporate interests, as we know, that have been heavily affected by the impact of this pandemic. But it really, I think one of the positive lessons, perhaps not a model, but a lesson from that compensation commission is the need to identify, these small claims and the individuals that have been affected. So I think that lesson can certainly be taken forward, if not the model of the commission itself. So I'll stop there, William. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Richard. And you have raised quite a number of points. And along the lines of what you have said about national systems, and you've highlighted some that are in progress or in the making, but you are also aware that they don't always work as efficiently as it is reported in the press. And I was wondering if the ILO, with all its technical kind of expertise, is it possible for the ILO in this current time, because it also might be, and this just might be, that governments don't know how to respond to this situation in a time like this. So could the ILO fast track, for example, a whole, which are the countries that have been doing this well, giving access to migrant workers, justice to migrant workers, make a kind of compilation of the countries that are doing it. What are the systems that they have in place, so that I'm saying it from a selfish perspective, this would be a resource for this campaign, basically, so that we can then take this campaign forward to governments to say, look, if you don't know what to do, here are 10 countries that have done something, and maybe you can take a hybrid of it or just replicate any of this. Is this something that the ILO could think of? The other thing to I would like to ask is, again, for the ILO, it's this being an issue that is, I'm not sure where the ILO is now in terms of COVID and thinking of post-COVID and things like that. And we've heard about your report and the thing of job losses and things like that. I'm wondering if within the ILO itself, is there scope of looking at migration? And like Shahidul Haq just said a little while earlier, justice as an entitlement. Is it possible for the ILO to start a conversation of this, just simply because of the enormity of this issue and how it's impacting workers, how it's impacting workers on the ground, kind of thing? Is it possible within the ILO to start a conversation in a more formal way on this? So those two things.
Okay, thank you, William. Okay, with regard to the first point, and you're right, there is a big disconnect between what some governments say that they're succeeding on when it comes to access to justice and the systems in place, and the realities on the ground, right? And we see that a lot in the Middle East as well, that what we're sometimes told is a good model falls quite a bit short when we compare to what is taking place in other countries and other regions, as well as the resources and the capacities that go into building such systems up. And one of the things that we do when we work with governments in the region is to try and bring in this expertise to show them how a system, an access to justice system, where it's dispute resolution and how it interacts with the court system can work efficiently. And there is a lot of interest in this, not only from examples from outside the region, but also with regard to some of these examples that I've already mentioned, being put into place within the region. So minds are not closed to progress in this area. So that to some extent goes towards answering your question that yes, that the ILO can do more work when it comes to doing some more comparative work, research, comparing how different systems respond when it comes to migrant workers. But that's sort of more medium and long term, and I don't think it's something that can necessarily be done very quickly with regard to resolving the acute problems that are arising in terms of wage theft, non-payment, late payment of wages as a result of the pandemic, and which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. In terms of having, if you like, a higher level conversation around this at the ILO, I mean, that's really very much up to our constituents, as officials which serve the ILO secretariat, we obviously recognize this as an important issue that should be very much at the forefront when we discuss labor migration and the impact of the pandemic on migrant workers. And we hope that myself, Shabari, who's listening in, and others are doing our utmost in this regard. But there are also governance structures at the ILO. There's the International Labour Conference, which unfortunately did not take place this year for the first time since the Second World War. there's the governing body that will meet hopefully either virtually or physically in October. And this is where our worker representatives in particular, I say in particular, well, I was listening also to the fact that we also, of course, we also represent employers and they should be taking up this issue as well. But this is the forum where hopefully, our constituents themselves can come together in a concerted way to raise this within the ILO's internal agenda, so it is adequately addressed. Obviously, there are other international fora which have already been referred to. The Global Compact, the regional review of the Global Compact will be taking place across the regions this year. The GFMD, not least because of course it is chaired by the UAE, which is one of the countries very much at the center of the issue when it comes to the Middle East, and other regional dialogues. And I know you, William, and others are doing their bit in this regard. But also at the UN, the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, etc. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Richard, for those two. The sooner you can give us that compilation of countries where it works, the faster this campaign will pick up. So I will tell you that. For the other question, for those who are from countries of origin on this call, and for the people in the labor movement and trade union on this call, I like what Richard said. If we can push for this, this can work. This can be picked up by the ILO. So it's a lot of work that we need to do with countries of origin to say this has to happen. So let's take up that invitation from Richard to put this forward. And let me move now to our next speaker, Dilip Ratha, who is from the World Bank's specialist on migration and remittances. And many of us have heard Dilip speak very often, and he has been with us also in many of these journeys. And Dilip, I know you have made a strong case for remittances, and you have also been part of this call that has been launched by the Swiss and UK governments. The World Bank is part of that to say keep the remittances flowing. The question is, if workers should have remittances, have salaries, have wages to keep the remittances flowing. If they don't have that, how can they flow? The other point is, and I'm wondering if the World Bank, because of this data that you bring out, and it's huge, and I know you'll give us some of these figures of what this drop means, but the 20% drop, which is the general kind of indicator now, is even much bigger when you look at individual countries. For example, countries like Nepal, where it's much bigger than 20% kind of thing in terms of drops. I'm wondering if the World Bank, in bringing out these remittances, and you pose it from a development perspective, a poverty reduction perspective, and things like that, can you give us disaggregated data? How much money is lost, or how much remittances is lost because of wage theft in any given year? Is it possible for you to give us that kind of data to make it, for us to hit home that justice is also an entitlement, like Sir Shahid has said? So is that possible in how you all collect this data on remittances? Dilip.
Thank you, William. It's amazing to see the panel, the participants, and it's also really nice to see a number of friends I had not seen, at least on screen. And it would have been wonderful to do that in person, but of course we cannot do that. The question you posed to how much of the remittance decline in remittances is due to wage theft. If you pose the question that way, I would say that the entire 20% decline that we are looking at for 2020 is quite likely because of either migrants are facing unemployment or will face unemployment, or because their wages are falling. And some of the fall in wages would be because of renegotiation or recontracting by the employer saying, okay, my business is suffering, so I cannot pay you as much, so take a pay cut. Or the other part is the employer simply doesn't pay and runs away with the money. So there is definitely an element of wage theft. A significant part of remittance decline is because of wage theft. And I'm glad that you are looking at the justice angle in this whole thing, because the money is rightly of the migrant. It belongs to the migrant. And because migrants don't have a voice and access to quick justice, and often if the migrant raises his or her voice, then the person is deported quickly, often with the help of the judicial system. The voice is never heard, and employers know that. So they take advantage of it. So to put things in perspective, last year, remittances sent by migrant workers to low and middle income countries were $554 billion. That was only recorded remittances. And unrecorded remittances through hawala or through hand carry is additional. At that recorded level, 2019 marked a milestone in the sense that for the first time, remittances overtook also foreign direct investment flowing through all the multinational companies of this world to low and middle income countries. That's a remarkable fact. Remittances sent by poor migrant workers in small little transactions like $200 or $50, they add up to a larger amount than all the money flowing through all the multinational companies in the world. That is a remarkable fact. This year, because of the crisis, the lockdown of businesses closing, not being able to operate, because of social distancing and travel bans, which have got people stranded in wherever they are, we are expecting that remittances would fall by 20%. So that would be about $109 billion. And in countries like Nepal, where remittances are already 1/3 of the national income, the fall would be larger. Indeed, the fall would be larger in fragile and conflict-affected countries like Haiti or Afghanistan, Somalia, South Sudan. The fall would be even larger. So a large number of families back home that had escaped poverty, they were at the borderlines of the poverty or below the poverty line, and they had escaped poverty because of remittances coming in on a sustainable basis month after month, and even more so in times of difficulty. There is a risk now that many of them would fall back into poverty. And then there is the problem with food insecurity that can affect in countries that are already vulnerable to food security issues. For example, East African countries or Zimbabwe, where there were already worries about locusts, for example, in East Africa. And this problem will compound that. So some problems that we had not thought about for a long time, like food insecurity, malnutrition, they would probably come back with the fall in remittances. So what you are seeing now is the crisis causing more of wage theft and unemployment and wage losses, and that translating into lower remittances, which would then translate into lots of hardships at very individual level. We knew that remittance recipient families in Sri Lanka or in Mexico had children with higher birth weight. Maternal health was better in families that receive remittances. All that would be unraveled now. So it's a serious humanitarian difficulty. And coming back to the question of what to do about wage theft or what to do with stranded migrants now. A few things, and then I'll talk about a couple of ideas that have been proposed in this conversation. First, migrants are stranded, and they are stranded because migrants tend to go to mostly urban economic centers. They are stranded in urban economic centers. And if migrants are not healthy, no one is healthy given the current crisis, current pandemic. So there is an urgent need to take care of stranded migrant workers and all migrant workers, especially those in dormitories and labor sort of camps. Not only to help these people who are in millions, but also to help the native population, the citizens themselves in the host communities. So that's the first point. So social protection measures, cash transfers, healthcare provision, provision to housing, access to healthcare and hygiene, running water. These are, there is a need for those measures to be inclusive of migrant workers. Even if they're not their own people, they are there, and host countries, host communities need to take care of the migrant workers just for their own sake. So that's the number one need, policy recommendation, policy suggestion. Second one, relating to remittances, is to recognize remittances as essential services and then try to keep remittances flowing, because every dollar spent through remittances or to benefit migrant workers would translate into helping many, many more people, 4, 5, 6, 10 people back home in other communities back home in the origin countries. So the same dollar spent by a host community government will translate into benefiting so many more people out there. So there is a very strong reason to do that, to be inclusive of migrants. And of course, not to forget that origin countries also do not always take care of families of migrants because they fall off the books, so to say. They fall through the cracks. So there is that need. There is a talk about increasing online remittance transactions, like everything online is taking place now. The problem with online remittance transactions is that they require financial inclusion. They require access to bank accounts and credit cards. And the laws in most communities, both actually origin countries as well as host countries, do not allow opening of bank accounts either by the migrants or sometimes, actually oftentimes, for the money transfer companies themselves. So these are sort of some recommendations that come right away. Now, talking about wage theft and some ideas that have been proposed. First, to point out, it's not only the wage theft, it is the whole social security package that is stolen. It was being stolen all along. We know that the taxes paid by migrants into social security systems, the contributions to social security system, pensions, healthcare, those things do not accrue to the migrants until they retire, unless they retire in the destination country. So it's a systematic way of stealing migrants' money. And that has become even more important in the current context, when every penny that the migrant can bring home would be so much more important now. So there is that overall, overarching issue. And in that context, the justice system that you are proposing of registering the cases, perhaps even rating employers, having a track record of employers. Okay, here is people do that. The trade value chain, global value chain for, let's say, textile or carpet trade. There are companies which are being rated on according to whether they are working with suppliers who hire child labor or who do abuses of workers. Why can't we do the same about construction companies and about all the good companies out there? So there is that need as well. And then the final point about starting a fund and international collaboration. These two are related issues. See, the international institutions, they all have their mandate. There is probably only one institution out there which is really the only mandate is to look at migration. But that organization does everything for which it gets money. And then the other organizations, they look at migration only as the third item or the 30th item or the 300th item. They all have their mandate. So first of all, we need an organization whose mission is very, very clear about what it does about migration. There isn't one right now. If there is an organization, it does not have a mission, or it has a mission that is completely confounded and it does not stick to the mission. So there is that need. And related to that is the whole issue of you cannot be independent and do something unless you have money. So you need the political mandate, but you also need the money. That is where the need for funds comes in. And nobody has put together the data on how much money the world spends in managing migration. And some part of it will be about managing recruitment process, recruitment costs, recruitment malpractices. But managing migration, I think probably several $100 billion are spent every year, not cumulatively, every year, by rich countries and poor countries too. If a certain part of that were allocated to a fund and create a migration financing facility or financing facility, it would be a concessional financing facility to address many issues, but in particular, the most important issue is that if there is a host community or a host country government, it just does not have the framework to use taxpayers' money to spend on foreigners. It just does not have a framework. Migration has the global public good element. And those host countries, including, for example, what happened in the case of, let's say, Syrian refugees in Lebanon or Jordan, a concessional financing facility was created so that host countries could actually take care of foreign-born people. Now there is a move on the part of many rich country governments to change aid, the definition of aid, and count what is spent by them to take care of refugees, including agents that address refugee issues, their costs, to include those costs and count them as aid. So the aid number we see, official aid number, actually the true aid, if you look at time series 5 years ago or 10 years ago, they are not comparable. The migration financing facility, therefore, is needed as a global public good to support global public efforts to address migration issues, including wage theft, because there is the global public good element here. And finally, awareness raising, like the work you do, and is raising awareness on the part of businesses, on the part of civil society, on the part of governments, members of parliament all over the world, and finally, educating migrants about their rights and enabling them is what is really needed. In the end, migrants have to fend for themselves as they have always done. And that is where most of the bang for the buck would come. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Dilip. You surely have raised a lot of provocative thoughts and are given a lot of ideas. Really like the whole idea of and this might be an idea for us when we think of building back better, is how can social protection be part of the new contracts that are there, because this is the missing element for sure, and this might be something to put in definitely in the new contracts and in the new kind of governance that we are looking at. I also like very much and how you've broadened the campaign. It's not only wage that is stolen, but the whole social security package that is stolen. And I think this is the insight definitely that we are looking at as well. The idea of a migration facility, this is the fund facility, and I've seen my colleagues like Mayan on this call, and I'm sure they will reflect about this in the days to come. And it is true. I think there has to be something like this. And you have rightly pointed out the limitations of the institutions that we have, and it's not all in dealing with migration. And then even if they come together in any conglomerate, in kind of collective, whether it's the GMG, which used to exist, or whether it is the UN network now, they don't seem to have that capacity to address issues like this. And so we might want to look at this, and that's why I like this. And I like the idea also that if we calculate how much is spent on governance and managing migration kind of thing, if a small portion, a fraction of that could be put aside for this kind of a financial facility that you are talking about, that will be fantastic. But I was wondering, and I'll come back to you on this with a question, is to say, you've said rating of employers. I know there are several kind of programs and applications now among trade unions. The ITUC has one in collaboration with MFA of this rating of employers and recruiters and things like that. But I want to come back to you on this question that I asked you. Is it possible in this remittances data then to be actually showing, just like how you have a rating, can we show in which corridors, migration corridors, there is this big issue of wage theft? Like, is it possible to bring out data like this, to hold states? Because only if the World Bank does something like this and has the capacity to do something like this in terms of make that data talk, break it down in a way that it talks to the ordinary man, because remittances, billions and numbers and things like that, we get lost in that, even in the calculation. How do they calculate? But when you talk about it in terms of wage theft and you break it down to the ordinary man, then you realize what is at stake here. So is that possible for the World Bank to actually do something like that in the data that you all put out?
Yes, it is possible. It would be controversial, but if we go through, World Bank is a cooperative of 190 odd governments, and we could put a proposal of this kind to them, and if they say it's okay, we can go ahead with it. Without that, it would be difficult. What that means is migration brings the complexity of having host country government and the origin country government, actually in plural. So host country governments and origin country governments, and indeed every country is both a host country as well as a origin country. So it brings that complexity of multilateralism right away. And there is a reluctance on the part of major governments to bring migration into a multilateral kind of forum, and World Bank is one, right? So with that caveat, purely highlighting the issue of wage theft, I don't think anybody would disagree that that should be avoided, because there is also, as with ILO, with Richard and with Michelle Layton and all, we are working on with NOMAD on the Sustainable Development Goal to reduce recruitment costs paid by workers. And that is a Sustainable Development Goal indicator, 10.7.1, right? And as part of that, we are doing surveys of how much individual migrant workers are paying for getting the to be able to get the visa, the recruitment cost indicator itself. And we also need data for that. We are collecting data on how much that cost is compared to the wages they would earn abroad, right? I think we can add questions on elements of wage theft, but there are difficulties because migrants in the host communities don't talk. They don't want to talk about these issues because they're afraid. We had that experience in Spain, our first pilot on this that Nomad did. We had to go through employers, and of course, then nobody wants to talk, right? That problem is there. So now we are interviewing return migrants, and using the recollection, they can tell us a little bit about what was lost, what was gained. Your idea of talking to the migrant workers and registering their grievance at the time of repatriation or immediately after that, quite likely, if you do that when they are in the plane, if you're able to identify them, because there is a bit of time there, I think it can be done. It can be done. And even if we are able to do that for 1,000 people to start with, that would be a wealth of knowledge. So long answer to say that your proposal is good, it can be done, and we'll look into that.
Thanks, Dilip. And just to say, we ourselves are trying to build the evidence for it. We have asked countries of destination to do it at the repatriation time, but we are also suggesting they do it at the quarantine time. The 14 days and quarantine is another moment. So we are putting the data together on this, and we're happy to share it with you as soon as we've got something going that is substantive. But last and not least, now let me come to our last speaker, and Neha Mishra, who has made the most sacrifice from among all of us to be on this call today. She was actually on leave because it's her son's birthday, and I asked her if she could give us her time for this. And Solidarity Center has co-launched this call as well. So Neha, over to you. The labor movement, this constituency that is the workers' constituency. What can the labor movement do and should be doing in advancing this call and bringing attention? And we've heard Richard say earlier as well, if there is enough pressure from the constituency, the ILO can take this up at a high level meeting kind of thing. So what are your thoughts on some of this? Thank you.
Thank you so much, William. And I think those who know William Goes know that he's probably one of the few people who could have convinced me to do this call this morning on my son's birthday. He's very persuasive. So thank you all. And the other just one funny thing that I just want to say as a American Desi, I'm very excited to be on this call today with so many of my South Asian brothers and sisters. It's really heartening to kind of to see and be a part of this discussion. I also just want to say a big thank you to MFA for leading this campaign and for the Solidarity Center staff in South Asia who joined with MFA from the beginning to kind of launch this idea, because this is something that as a labor movement and as trade unions, we have been saying for decades. You know, one of the things that we see all the time in migration management and migration policy is that you'll get a lot of attention from governments on the most extreme cases, forced labor, trafficking issues, etc. But the everyday basic workplace rights violations of migrant workers often go ignored. And wage theft is the biggest one of that. But for decades, while the labor movement is saying these things, we couldn't get traction. So I'm so appreciative to MFA and, as I said, our Solidarity Center staff in South Asia and Lawyers Beyond Borders and CCRM and Sartuk and others for taking the opportunity that COVID is bringing us, despite how horrible it is, to raise the issue of basic workplace rights for workers, for migrant workers, and how do we address them in the form of wage theft. And, one thing that as a labor movement we've seen is that labor migration policy has been one of exclusion for years. That, the way migration processes are set up, it's everything about excluding migrant workers from the full protection of laws, excluding them from social protections and safety nets, as Dilip and others have talked about, excluding them from access to healthcare, excluding them from participation in the societies of destination countries. And most importantly for this conversation today is excluding them from basic workplace rights. So as a labor movement, as we're taking on this campaign to address wage theft, I think we need to start from the beginning and also have a push to ensure that basic workplace rights for migrant workers are adhered to, all of the basic ILO standards, and that we are not having different standards for workers depending on if they're undocumented migrant workers, documented migrant workers, nationals of a country, that there have to be the same labor laws, standards, and workplace rights for workers. That would be a first step. Among that, most importantly, is freedom of association. And what the labor movement sees in terms of wage theft issues, if we want to really operationalize this idea of transitional justice, we have to allow workers freedom of association and the right to have their own agency and representation in their workplaces. Now, I understand in many of these destination countries that we're talking about in the GCC and other places, there is not freedom of association, you don't have the right to unionization, etc. We can still, however, figure out ways to have worker agency and representation. And I think that it's going to be really hard in the ways so many people have discussed here to have workers, be able to collect the information about wage theft, to be able to feel like they won't be retaliated against if they're asking for their wage statements, if they're asking for the documentation that they're going to need to be able to bring cases, or to be able to collectively respond and to, wage theft might be happening in an entire workplace. That workers need to be able to have agency and act collectively in order to do that. Several global union federations have signed on to the Transitional Justice campaign, including Building and War Workers International, which represents construction workers around the world. And I know we have some members from BWI on this call. Public Services International, which represents nurses and teachers and other healthcare workers around the world, the International Trade Union Confederation, and others. And as William has said, those are the constituency for the worker representatives to the ILO, and we can work together with the Council of Global Unions Migration Committee, which includes all these unions, that is led by Ambit Yuson, who's the Secretary General of Building and Woodworkers International, to push this idea forward at the ILO to ensure, to find a way to have this brought up there and to deal with some of the power imbalances that other people were talking about earlier that we have between countries. I think that we also need to see, William was talking before about the power imbalances between countries of origin and countries of destination. And the way to deal with some of those power imbalances is to be a bloc. And I think my colleague Alonzo Suson in the chat had noted that, if the majority of the countries in South and Southeast Asia that make up, the origin countries for migration, migrant workers going to various countries can come together as a bloc, that would be really strong. And we could do that at the ILO. That's the place to do that. So if you have a block of these origin countries, governments that are bringing this to the ILO, and then you have the labor constituency from worker organizations together with other civil society at the ILO bringing this, I think that'll be really strong and powerful. The other thing that the labor movement is doing right now on this idea is calling for a new social contract, which the new social contract goes to what William and Dilip and others were talking about ensuring that when we're building back together, William, to use your terms, that we're doing it in a way that is ensuring that there's a floor, a labor floor for workers, where it's not only about protections and social safety nets, but it's also about job guarantees. One of the things that I think we need to look at as a part of this post-COVID world is the creation of decent work in origin communities. And I know that's not part of our topic today, but I just want to put a flag there for it, because as we're dealing with wage theft and other issues, we have to make sure that there are alternatives for workers as they're returning, and that there are good alternatives to deal with if countries aren't going to respond to the wage theft issue. How do we deal with that? And then just the last thing I'll say, William, because I know we're almost out of time. I understand the difficulties that people have been talking about with a potential international claims court, et cetera. I still think it's a really important conversation for us to be having. The issues that, as I said, these are basic workplace rights that we have been saying as a labor movement for decades that we need to bring out. And the only way I think that we're really going to get the attention we need is to have a real conversation, a practical, concrete conversation about an international claims court. And I get that it's hard, and maybe not, it won't happen, William, but it's worth having the conversation because we are beyond time for that. And just the last thing I'll say, building on what Dilip was saying, is in addition to the International Claim Court, which might be a little harder, although I really think we can use the ILO as a mechanism, I do think a fund, as everyone was saying, is a possibility, and they can be two conversations that we're having. And so I'll just end, William, with saying that I know I was talking with, as I said, my colleagues from BWI and others. The global labor movement is committed to this campaign. The Council of Global Unions wants to take it up. We're committed to bringing it to the ILO. But I think we need really very much to focus on workers being able to have agency and representation and collective action, freedom of association, and we address basic workplace rights for workers. Again, thank you so much, William.
No, thank you, Neha, and you have hit the nail on the head on many of the issues. And let me just say, actually, before the webinar started, I was on a call with Ambit Yusen, who is Secretary General of the Council of Global Unions, and he did say that they have already discussed this and they are looking at how to take this up to the ILO. So I see, Rishad, your eyebrows lifting. So it's good. It's coming home. So I hope we get this. And it is important to take up. I also like what you're saying, Neha, that it's not only wage theft, and it is true. We saw that on a regular basis. You do so many case handling work on so many issues, and yes, you're right. We'll have to go back to the very fundamentals of how these labor agreements are put together, how labor migration is governed, and all of this. And fundamental to that, at the end, just like Dilip said as well, it's the agency of the workers. The workers will have to have that voice, that confidence, that power to be able to speak in their own name. And that comes with freedom of association and the power to go and the possibility to come together. So thank you very much for that. Now we have very little time, but I'm going to ask I'm going to start the same slate, go around with the same slate. But I'm going to ask each of the panelists a more personal question, and that is going away from this webinar, what are you taking for yourself or your organization to follow up with in relation to this campaign? Yeah. So going back from the start, what are you for yourself and for your organization? Because I know that each one of you is an instrument of transformative change. I have seen each one of you work, and I know how you make things possible. And I'm asking you to make this possible, this campaign possible. And so I'm asking you this personal question as well, is what are you taking back from this webinar, from all that you've heard, that you can take for yourself and for your organization moving forward? So let me first start with then Rula. Yeah, since Shashi is not here. But Shashi has already said he will retweet and tweet or whatever on this whole webinar and the learnings from this webinar, and especially the 2 suggestions that came while he was talking. So he's going to do that for sure. Rola, what are you going to do?
Yes, that's an unexpected question, William. But no, I think in general it's been a really kind of a good conversation and a big conversation. But I also want to say, I mean, sometimes it's about these small things and these small steps that can take us far as well. And I mean, in terms of what needs to happen and our part of it, I mean, I think there are lots of things that will need to happen and that we will need to kind of work together to make them happen. And I mean, in kind of the looking at kind of things that need to happen in the short term, I would imagine kind of the question of documentation is really something that's really essential. And that's something not just for us as, civil society to take forward, but that's something that will need to be addressed also by countries of destination, by countries of origin, by missions, by international organizations. So this is something I think is one takeaway. Another takeaway, and I guess, is as civil society, this is something that we've been doing and will continue to do, is the whole notion of legal assistance. And that has come up in the webinar. But also there are other actors that can play into this, countries of destination, obviously. And I think this is kind of an item that we've been pushing in terms of advocacy to provide kind of free legal aid or accessible legal aid and all of that. So I think that's kind of another thing to take from that. Again, the question of helping returnees when they come back to reintegrate, and not just reintegrate in terms of socially and all of that, but also reintegrate in the country of origin in terms of what opportunities are there for them. I think that also goes into making sure that, not just the immediate aspect in terms of justice is there, but that, people are at the center of this and people are really kind of what's pushing this. I mean, other things, we've spoken a lot about this, and I think it's really important for us and others to continue the advocacy around. the whole notion of the International Claims Commission that we are pushing for. I think it's really essential that we all come together to push for that, not just a few of the actors, but more people need to come on board and more people need to take up this agenda as their own. At the national level, I think, again, that's something for more people to come on board and work with us on, to really push for reforms of the justice at the national system. And I think really it's kind of the right time for us to start making the noise about this and to start to raise the issue again and again and again until it really something's happened, something triggers. So I guess, I've said about, what our part is this, but I think it's also a collective of all of us coming on board for that.
Thank you, Rola, for that, and thank you for the commitment for the campaign as well. Shahid al-Haq, sir, are you still there? Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Fascinating discussion.
You gave. I know that the whole concept of the Global Compact on Migration was in many ways your brainchild. You gave this to the international community. I was there when the early discussions were started. How can you help us take this campaign forward?
Good. As you have said, William, that what is the takeaway? I think we have to continue to hammer that rights of migrant matters for all societies. One. The second one, you cannot build better without an inclusive society. Second is, I know, William, you are in consultation with the government of Bangladesh. The whole issue of putting forward a mechanism. I'm pursuing it with the government, and that will be my commitment that I'll try and force it. I will just flag that if this, and that's my own experience of couple of years in this. If you want these set of a campaign to lift off and take a shape in real sense, you have to have need a strategic move and strategic partner. Now, I know we attach huge importance on UN, especially the poor little developing countries. But I have also seen being part of the system and also as someone outside the system, possibly except the Secretary General, there hardly anyone in the system who would try and put his job at stake, which we have also heard from our UN colleagues. So yes, let's work with them, but look at other strategic partner, especially in the civil society, because I think the civil society has always been pioneer, always been provocative, always been leading the debate. The thing that we are today in terms of rights of migrant workers wouldn't have been here if the civil society wouldn't be with us. If we have continued to bang on the UN system, we had ended up almost going nowhere. So that's one. And the other partner, if you wish, I can sort of create the corridor, is World Economic Forum. They're receptive. They see this in a different angle from the challenge of their business, but they see value of these kinds of a thing in terms of ethical business. So that's my kind of takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And thank you for your personal commitment to take it up with your own government. And this World Economic Forum is an animal I've not grappled with, but I take that idea of yours and I will see how to make that happen. And I see Dilip also nodding his head around that time. So it might be good for us to, yes, have another conversation on how we can raise this with the World Economic Forum. But thank you for that idea as well. And now, Rishad, the ILO.
Yes, hi, William. I think, one of the things that, how would I say, frustrates me personally is that when we talk about these rights issues in the context of migration governance, we're not short of standards or agreements on the level of the international community, right? So the question, the issue around equal justice for all, right, is there in ILO standards and human rights standards. It's there in the SDGs. There's a specific target on this, 16.3, where member states have committed to promote the rule of law at the national and international levels and ensure justice, equal access to justice for all, right? We have quite a few references to access to justice for migrants, including those in working informally in the Global Compact. So we're not short of standards or directions at the international level when we come to this issue, but there is such a disconnect between its application and practice, and particularly when it comes to migrants. That's the frustrating thing. But the two issues I'd like to raise, of course, is that we have to work on, if you like, on both fronts. On the first front being that there are immediate justice issues here. We've all heard of the phrase "justice delayed is justice denied," right? And there are a lot of individuals that are suffering, that have not just lost months of wages, but and the service benefits, as I mentioned earlier, savings in some regard as well, because they've had to rely on a lot of their savings to if they've had any, to compensate for loss of wages. So documentation, as Rula mentioned, is really important. We have to try and document these cases as much as possible wherever we can. And I know, for example, that many of my colleagues in Asia are assisting migrant workers who are returning to document, to register their complaints through, in some cases, in collaboration with migrant resource centers where they exist, right? So documenting and registering these complaints is really important. And then the second thing really is to use this experience to move forward the broader policy reform agenda when it comes to reforming access to justice mechanisms for migrant workers, across the world, and obviously in the region where I see a lot of deficits in the Middle East as well. And so we should be using this extreme experience, if you like, that we're encountering in the context of the pandemic, and that to move for policy change, and that will help. It will help the more evidence that we have that we can use in our arguments in the ILO's case with its constituents, and particularly with governments. That would be very important going forward.
Thanks, Richard. And I can see Alonso's thing that ILO can try to get the evidence as well. But like I said, we are also gathering this evidence. Let me move now to Dilip.
Thanks, William. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, go ahead, Dilip. Dilip?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. We're getting an echo, but okay, go ahead.
I would like to work on the data and the fund. My apologies.
Sir, mobile you can off so that it will be okay. You can mute your mobile and then.
I heard you, Dilip. You said work.
Yes. Is it better?
Yes,
sorry about that.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, my apologies. I had it on phone for a minute. Just to say two things. We really need data to look at the phenomenon and to do the advocacy and the solutions. So in your work, if you do the data work on wage theft, and incidence of that, that would be very, very helpful. That's the most important point. And then the broader point about the Migration Facility Fund is needed. And I have to leave. Thank you. It's an excellent session.
Thanks.
Bye.
For all those who are on this call who are part of our networks, remember the data part, and we have to collect this evidence. We have already the ILO and the World Bank that we can take it to say this is the data. We need to do something. Finally, Neha, I saw your son there a little while ago. I know he's asking for his birthday celebration. I won't keep you long, but please go ahead.
Thank you so much, William. And so just the last thing I'll say, you know that Solidarity Center is committed to this campaign with MFA, as we were one of the original members who joined on with you. So we are absolutely committed. We're going to put resources behind it, staff behind it. But the one thing that I want, and the one thing I wanted to mention, is that we have a network called International Lawyers Assisting Workers Network, ILAW, ILAW network. I put it in the chat. If there are labor lawyers on this call, I highly encourage you to join ILAW and join on to us, because we would like to use the ILAW network to support the campaign with bringing cases, but also brainstorming ideas that may work, best practices in other places, work and other things like that. So just want to put a plug in for ILAW there, and it's in the chat. And then, of course, again, working closely with BWI and the Council of Global Unions to bring this idea forth with our civil society partners' voices to the ILO. And so those are my two commitments, William.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Neha, for that. Before I hand over to Sada from GRFDT to close it, to the 324 people who are still on this call, please think of ways in which you can support this campaign. You have given us more than 2 hours of your time today. If you give us 2 hours of your time once a week for this call, that will definitely make this call a realization. It will operationalize this call, and it will make a huge difference in the lives of so many migrant workers. So for whoever's on this call, I invite you to think of how you can support the call. Civil society, documentation, researchers, academics, you can write papers, policy briefs, research notes, whatever it is. In whatever way you can support this call, know that you will be making a difference, a very big difference. I'd like to thank everybody or the panelists who gave their time to this. Thank you so much for being part of this. Each one of you, like I said, has been very instrumental in advancing the rights of migrant workers. In this time of COVID, more than ever, we need each other, and we need to make sure that as we build back together, the building back is on much stronger foundations, foundations where justice is an entitlement. Thank you so much for all of you, and thank you for all those who have helped us in this last 3 weeks on these webinars. I see Shabri Nair there as well from the ILO, who has been a constant support as well. Thank you GRFTD, thank you Rola and team, and Lawyers Beyond Borders, and Lakshman, who initially gave us this idea when he started talking about social protection for migrant workers. Lakshman from SATUC has been one of the brain childs of this campaign. So I'd like to thank him as well. And for everybody else in MFA who has been part of this struggle and who continues to be part of this struggle. Thank you so much. Sada, I'll let you do the closing.
Thank you, William, for giving that great note, calling everyone to participate in this campaign. In fact, all are part of this campaign. There is nobody is left out, starting from migrant labor to ILO to World Bank. So we had 3 conversations so far in collaboration. One was on global and regional governance. Second one was diplomatic mission, role of diplomatic mission. And this one is about transitional justice. Our main purpose was to take it forward. This is not the end of our 3 conversation, but it is like a kind of foundation we want to build on and take forward. And all of you have given so much input which are related to data gap, understanding the issue, and so many. It is like a complex phenomena, is an elephant in a dark house where each one we touch, we feel it is different. But if we actually make conversation, we put light on the elephant, we know what is it. So this is what we are doing in the first case. We are making a conversation, series of conversation. And Today, I want to give thanks to Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Honorable Member of the Parliament, who has spoken and who will also take forward this conversation further, and he has been working on this issue for a long time. Ambassador Shahidullah Haq, who has been working in this area, and we have listened to him also the last conversation, and he has been taking forward throughout. Dr. Dilip Roth, who has been working on remittance, and this is where the poor migrant states are there, and all the poor countries are also part of that. His contribution goes to not just poor people, but entire globe. Then we have Mr. Richard, ILO, who has spoken about what ILO can do now. And we have Neha Mishra, who has been in the forefront of the campaign. Besides that, I tell you, who are the behind the scene always, like Sabri, who has been actually brought together three organizations and made this conversation possible. Thank you, Sabri, so much. William and Rola, you trusted us, and this is a great combination. I tell you, we have grassroots level organization like Rola, and your organization who are working in grassroots and policy level, and Rola also working on lawyers front, giving justice. So we have a large array of activities we can generate in each of our network, and also we can bring so many things together, from data gathering to collaboration, strategy building, and all these are now beginning we have made. I think long way to go. I must thank Dr. Mule, who chaired the last session on that diplomatic mission. He has given a new beginning to bringing the government agencies to this platform, and there is much more to do. And I think there is no end now. We have begun some work. We have to go very far now, and we'll take stock of all this. As William suggested, let's after three conversations, we'll make reflection what we are doing and how to go forward. And this is really, we have this three conversation. We made some beginning, and all the audience, maybe we request you to give your feedback, be partner of this all this campaign, and give your best. Before I also end, I must say that our GRFDT members who have been great support, and the member of CCRM, the member of MFA, and Sabri's group, all up, it is not a just few people who are coming forward in the front. We have a huge team who are behind us, giving support all the time. I thank you all, and look forward for a new future now. Let's see the crisis bring new innovation, new way to work out, new strategy, and let's think how to think fresh. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So we'll announce the next conversation maybe after 3-4 days. Till then, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Great job, everybody.
Thank you.
Binod.
Sir.
Saiful.
Good to see Saiful, Thomas, Binod.